How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with Mark Stiles of Stiles Law and your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show.
Gary! Hey, Larry! Woo. Big a round of applause. We've got such a huge studio audience today. Mark, it was great.
Larry's fired up, I bet, because of Veterans Voice 10-year anniversary today. What?
That's right. Congratulations, Veterans Voice. If you're listening on the way home,
Greg
you guys
and
are doing
Wolfie.
incredible stuff.
God's work.
And it really is. I mean, helping those veterans. I was listening to some of it tonight and hearing how folks come up to you and say, "You saved my life." You know, that is powerful. Our veterans, the suicide rate among our veterans is just, it's really shameful on us that we've let that happen, that we've got these people who have helped us, protected us, and we then, what? We don't recognize the trauma that they've been through.
We don't value what they've done.
Value what they've done. So congratulations to Veterans Voice. So proud of you. Working mental health through the radio for 10 years, 500 plus shows, because they go every week except for Thanksgiving.
And you see what they're doing on Thursdays. They're doing a food drive outside of WATD as well. They're wonderful, wonderful people. Glad to know them. Honored to know them.
Honored
doing
to know
such great work.
Yeah. Tough act to follow, but we follow them nonetheless.
It is. We will try. We will do our best.
It's about mental health. It's about helping other people. It's about being there for others. And with that in mind, Mark, could you introduce our guest for tonight?
Absolutely, Dr. Joe. Tonight's guest is currently a clinical assistant professor at University of Montreal and director of the Substance Abuse, Use, and Addiction Program. He is exploring the prevention and treatment of mental health and substance use conditions among adolescents and young adults. So we're going to be talking about drug story theater here tonight, folks. This guest was the first pediatrician in North America to complete a pediatric addiction medicine fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. Folks, please welcome Dr. Nicholas Chadi. Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be with you.
It is so good to see you, Dr. Chadi. And just to catch up as well, folks, Nicholas and I, we worked together at Castle when he was doing his fellowship. How long ago was that?
That was actually 7 years ago, believe it or not. Six or 7 years ago.
That is wild. And it was wonderful having you there and the kids just really connected because you're real. I mean, that's the part. That's the most important part when it's working with adolescents, with anyone really, is just be yourself. Be yourself. So what are you up to these days? What's happening?
Well, so I'm, as mentioned, a professor at the University of Montreal up in Canada. I spend about half of my work time doing research and half of my work time seeing patients under the age of 18, primarily with substance use and substance use disorders. And so I've been very lucky to be surrounded by my two wonderful teams to support these young people and to try to improve the care that we can provide as pediatricians, as health providers working with young people. And it's been a really tremendous experience doing that for the past 5 years after finishing training in Boston in 2019.
And what's the research? What are you looking at?
Well, I basically wear three hats when it comes to research. The connecting dots are really the mental health aspect here. So I'm very interested in understanding what leads young people to initiate use of different substances at a young age. And so looking at different trajectories and seeing what are the effects of using substances during adolescent years and how that may translate in different impacts on professional life, on happiness and mental health later down the road. So I have the opportunity of working with very large cohorts of young people, now adults, and looking at their outcomes throughout the life course. And that's really taught me a lot of things, that how early you start using substances, how intensely you use them during the key periods of adolescent brain development can really, really shape how your life will look like later on. And so that's my first hat. And then finally, as an adolescent medicine doctor, I do inpatient call on a very busy eating disorder service. And well, us being in 2024 and just coming out of a very long pandemic, there were opportunities to study different ways of providing care, mainly virtually. And so one of my interests have been to provide care in new and different ways, combining in-person and virtual care for young people specifically affected with eating disorders. So those are my three main hats, and it keeps me quite busy with a lot of emerging research questions and a tremendous number of opportunities to collaborate with researchers and clinicians and also patients. And young people are part of my research teams on all of these different projects and initiatives.
Mm.
Well, certainly, we're in a digital era, and digital and social media and screens and smartphones have several deleterious or problematic effects if we use them too much, especially for a young person.
Recording in progress.
But they also certainly offer access to a lot of information. So based on my clinical experience and research experience, what I see is that young people are learning and understanding what it is to be transgender much earlier in life than before. When I was in elementary school, I didn't know what it was to be transgender. Most young people in elementary schools now will be able to tell you what a transgender person is, and will tell you, "Oh yeah, I've seen this video online. I've heard this influencer," and certainly that brings a lot of dialogue. And so it's never easy to be a teen. Not now. It wasn't a generation or two ago. It probably won't be in the next generation or two. But there are a lot of new and emerging questions for teens nowadays, trying to understand their identity. And certainly gender is one of those dimensions that have become much more present. And I would say probably with this access to information.
Mm. So I sometimes call it anti-social media because I think there's so much happens on it that really, as you say, it can be deleterious. I mean, it can not only take up so much time, but you can have bullying that follows you wherever you go. Is that part of what you're finding?
Certainly. And so I'm seeing a lot of young people who will spend a tremendous number of hours on social media trying to find themselves, really, or find what, what's good, what's right for them. And social media platforms will just feed you more of what you search for. And then you can go down those spirals of being stuck in certain very specific areas of content that can lead you down a path that could sometimes be very helpful and positive, but sometimes would lead to comparisons or this kind of eternal search for perfection or for this or that image or portrait or picture or persona you're trying to achieve. And so when starting to look into things like gender identity, you can get into both positive and very negative and sometimes even violent content. And so certainly those are all things that I'm seeing in my practice.
Mm. Well, it certainly, can be a path to worry, but also to be really supportive. And we are very fortunate to have our own supportive folks, our sponsors, who have helped us get to where we are now on our social media platforms. So, Larry, with that in mind, let's take a commercial break. We'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show and Nicholas Chadi.
Hey, folks, thank you for listening to the Dr. Joe Show. We've been investigating whether or not we want to bring sponsors into our podcast. What are your thoughts? Do you know somebody who might be a good partner with the Dr. Joe Show, who may want to align their product or service with the Dr. Joe Show? Think about it.
And we are back with the Dr. Joe Show. Thank you, Larry. We are with Dr. Nicholas Chadi, and we're talking about adolescence.
Yeah. And substance use and brain development and
all
what
of it
happens. So let's go there to the substance use. What are you guys looking at? How are you designing your research, looking at outcomes? Tell us about that.
Several things. So I started becoming really interested in substance use when I was training in adolescent medicine in 2015, 2016. And if y'all remember, that was around the time where e-cigarettes really became very popular among young people. And I was really fascinated to see how quickly this became not just a trend or a fad, but really a habit and then an addiction for some. And so I sort of developed different projects around e-cigarettes. And one of the projects that I'm very involved with now is trying to provide cessation for nicotine use to young people and also to their parents. Because we know that substance use can run in families and across generations. And so I was mentioning a little bit earlier, I've had the opportunity to look at very large numbers of young people and have surveys every year for periods of up to 20, 25 years, looking at use of different substances, patterns, trajectories, and then comparing mental health outcomes among young people who were using and not using at different parts of their lives. And, going as early as in utero exposure to smoke, nicotine from mothers and fathers, to use during adolescence and continued use during young adulthood. And it's really interesting to see that young people who use and are exposed to tobacco during pregnancy, even, preconception, have an increased risk of using other substances, and certainly a very tangible risk of having higher rates of mental health issues and lower rates of employment, lower income, and lower life achievement markers. And so I'm very interested to see that. And with some of my collaborators, we were able to sort of look at different trajectory groups. And so there seems to be a key period between the ages of 12 and 14 where starting then and there and starting intensely will really have those long-lasting effects. You'll see a group of young people who will use but very occasionally and start a little bit later. And I'm usually less concerned about that pattern of use, because what research is showing is that if you follow that trajectory, well, then you're much less likely to have these outcomes later on during the life course. And so it's really what I'm trying to continue to understand better. And then I guess the logical next step is, once we know that delaying the onset of use or reducing use during that period is very key, how can we intervene quickly and effectively? And there are so many ways to do that. And it starts with education and awareness. And it starts with timely screening and early intervention, and then targeting these young people who are sort of starting to really increase their use and getting them linked with services that will help. Knowing that substance use usually is driven by many different factors, not only access, but also social factors and risk factors related to the past and the present. And so all those things all come into the research that I'm doing, trying to understand and improve things for young people today and tomorrow.
It's so interesting. I mean, why do you think it is? What is it about even nicotine exposure? I mean, we know it's a gateway, nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, they're gateways to things that can be much more damaging. But nicotine, it's not benign, folks. Just because, nicotine is legal doesn't mean it's safe. So what do you think is actually happening? Why would it impair? Is it impeding prefrontal cortical function? The part of the brain where we're thinking and anticipating the future and making decisions. Do you think that's what it's doing?
Well, let's talk about the brain. As an adolescent medicine doctor, I love doing that. So what we've known for a very long time is that the brain stops getting bigger and heavier just around age 11 or 12. So a 12-year-old has an adult size brain. But what happens for the next 10 to 15 years is that the brain selects these connections, these synaptic connections between neurons that will really allow to reach that full level of brain development. And there are certain key areas you just alluded to, Dr. Joe, in the prefrontal cortex, where we we really think as quite evolved living beings, where we can plan and we can memorize and we can learn languages and do complex visual spatial tasks. And those areas of the brain really need to continue to develop. And so what happens with brain connections is, if they're used during a certain period of time, and the key period of time we're talking about here, adolescence, means that these connections will stay and strengthen. If there are connections, if there are patterns that are not being used, well, those sort of fall to oblivion, and those parts of the brain sort of get selected out, right? And that's what we call pruning as the scientific term. And so what I really think is happening is, when young people are being exposed to substances like nicotine, we're reinforcing a part of the reward pathway and really looking at those receptors to those substances that will fire up hormones like dopamine that bring you instant pleasure, but we know that's short-lived, to the expense of other parts of the brain that are also developing. And so this really sort of shifts how the brain develops and how it becomes. And we know that when the brain starts being exposed to rewarding substances, it sort of recognizes that pattern and seeks it in the future. Meaning that using one psychoactive substance will sort of predispose the brain to be more sensitive to other psychoactive substances, increasing the risk to addiction to substances later on in life. And we know there's a very tight connection with regulation of your emotions and your mood, which will bring a vulnerability to different mental health conditions. And so really that's how I understand it. And I think how our more complex imaging methods nowadays we have access to are really helping us understand what's happening in the developing brain.
Yeah. It's so important, folks, because for a long time we thought that addiction was about being morally corrupt, that somehow you were a bad person. But what Dr. Chadi is saying is what we're saying in Drugs for Theater. Addiction is not about morality. It's about mortality. It's just the way the brain works. So once the brain becomes sort of used to this pleasure principle, the pleasure that's fleeting, it then sets up a cascade effect where you just want more and more of that. Is that fair to say?
That's quite fair to say. And depending on the substance, that can happen really quickly. And that's one of the problems with the nicotine. It's a very short-acting substance. It reaches the brain within seconds if you inhale it. And it leaves the brain and body fairly quickly as well, leaving your brain screaming and wanting more. So after only a few days or weeks of use, young people can really be seeking that on and on and on. So it really doesn't take a very big and heavy exposure to really, be at risk of developing addiction to those substances with an impact potentially on the developing brain.
Yeah.
You talk about the cessation of nicotine for the adolescents and their parents. What type of treatment are you using to help with that?
Several different approaches. And so what's interesting, and also something I'm trying to contribute to, is that there's actually very little research showing how cessation methods we have for adults work for young people. There isn't a convincing study out there saying that nicotine patches or gums or different behavioral programs in schools or cessation groups or all those things, even online apps, really work. What my clinical experience is showing me is that combining several methods and looking at the underlying reasons why young people are using in the first place will actually take you a long way with great outcomes. And so that's exactly the research that I'm trying to do. We're looking at what are the key vulnerabilities, what are the reasons why young people, and parents also, because I work with parents, are using cigarettes or e-cigarettes or other forms of nicotine, and trying to connect them directly with as many different ways of supporting them as possible. So combining pharmaceuticals like nicotine replacement gums and patches and so on, medications that can be prescribed by a physician, but also very importantly, counseling and support, peer support, professional support, online apps, because there are some now and some are quite good. Texting, reminders, all sorts of methods together, and trying to customize and personalize that offering. And because we have access to more digital technologies and platforms, delivering that on a person's smartphone so that it's easy, so that it's it's not a struggle to get to those means. That's really what I'm trying to implement first in pediatric clinics as an opportunity. If you're coming for a health appointment, there you go. Let's connect you with resources and ways to help you quit nicotine use, and then following through time to see how that works. And it's been quite successful. That's an approach that's been in the US for a number of years now, and that we're implementing in Canada now in different ways and bringing in more technology into it.
That customization and personalization is so important because people are individuals and we can't just sort of lump them together. And what I'm so honored by is that our sponsors are, able to do the same thing. They customize, they personalize. When you connect with our sponsors, you're going to be getting the best individual treatment that you need, support. So with that in mind, Larry, let's take a commercial break and we'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show.
Hey folks, welcome back. So any thoughts? Do you listen to other podcasts? Do you see how they do the sponsors? Is there a way that they're utilizing sponsors that you enjoy or you don't enjoy? I listen to Smartless and I really enjoy how the co-hosts share the voiceover for the product or service. It's really funny for the most part, but it's unique. It's them really endorsing. Does that work? What do you think?
And we are back with the Dr. Joe Show with Dr. Nicholas Chadi. And we're talking about adolescence and substance use and nicotine and all that stuff.
Yeah. And then following them, I mean, off air, we were talking about the database we have access to. Can you just tell our audience about that?
Yeah, certainly. So in Quebec, the province I live in, with a population of about 9 million people, our national or provincial Institute for Statistics is linking all sorts of government registries together. So use of healthcare services, educational graduation rates, educational outcomes, prescription of different medications, employment, income, disability. All those databases are being linked and they're being associated to different research trials. And so having access to that tremendous amount of data for the entire population really allows to look at things very deeply. And so having a single identifier for a person would allow to track their use of all sorts of different services throughout the life course. And that really has not been done around the world. Some Scandinavian countries have very strong registries and databases, but they're not as comprehensive as what is being built in Quebec. So I'm very excited about the opportunity. It's something that's just starting. So one of the projects that I have is to look at young people coming to the hospital or to the emergency room because of a severe substance use condition.
Thank you, Nicholas.
So they come in, they're 14, they're 15, they use nicotine, they use cannabis, they used opioids, they've used a combination of different substances. What's next? What happens in the following years? Do they go back to use the healthcare system? Do they graduate from high school? Are their graduation rates different from young people who don't get hospitalized or don't go to the emergency room for this and that substance use condition? And so this is really where I'm going next. And I'll be curious to see how that sort of shapes and evolves throughout the life course. And we can go back and we can, plan to go in the future with these databases. And it's really, really interesting to look at all of that. And, we can use advanced statistical models to try to identify what are the biggest risk factors. What are the different levers we have? What time is it most impactful to this and not that? And, what are the key elements and things that young people need to thrive and have the best quality of life later on and so on and so forth. So really, really exciting things happening in research, certainly.
How does that database work? So you can track somebody who was admitted to a hospital as an adolescent and follow the path of where that person went if they graduated high school and had work experience as a anonymous, unnamed person. Like, how does that work?
So there's sort of two ways of doing it. So we can look at an event happening and then looking back at what happened prior. We don't need a person's consent to do that because these databases are large enough that it's going to be anonymized and results are going to be reported in aggregate. But we can also look at things, prospectively, how that will unfold in the future. And for that, we would usually ask for consent. So if a young person or not an adult is coming in to participate in a research study, we'll ask them, would you accept that we look at your data in the future and try to link that to different conditions? And generally, people are quite interested to contribute to that, knowing that it would also be anonymous. We won't say this person did that and had that. We'll also lump that all together. So this is really how it works. And the feedback that I get with the young people I work with is they're really happy to contribute to that research. And they actually want to know what's going to happen to people who, have similar experiences and contribute to science to make things better.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the phrases of drugs-free theater: contribute to society to help with your sobriety. Because when you are giving, it's a different rush. It's not pleasure, it's happiness, which is a very different neurotransmitter and much, much longer lasting. And that really is part of what we're trying to get across.
What's this drug story theater you speak of, Dr. Joe?
Oh, Mark, thank you for that. So as you know, we have a nonprofit where we take teenagers in the early stages of recovery. We teach them improvisational theater, and we use psychodrama, and they create their own scripted shows about the seduction of, addiction to, and recovery from drugs and alcohol. And then they perform those shows for middle schools and high schools. So the treatment of one becomes a prevention of many. In between each scene of the show, the kids step out of character and they do PowerPoint presentations, teaching the audience about the development of the adolescent brain and why it's at such risk for addiction, just as Dr. Chadi is saying. All the kids in the audience take a pre-show and a post-show neuroscience quiz. And we measure how kids change their perception. We're not trying to scare anyone. We just want to change your perception to say, you can choose drugs, but this is what happens. This is what's going on in the brain. It's not about whether you're a good kid or bad kid. We're actually doing a performance May 7th it's the Fentanyl Awareness Day here in the United States at the Mass Maritime Academy. And one of our kids has written a new play called Back to Life about Narcan and her experience with a friend who was overdosing. So that's open to the public. It's free. It goes from 6 to 9 o'clock, Mass Maritime Academy. Dr. Alex Wally will be there. He'll be talking. We have other people who will be joining us, but it's a pretty amazing show. So that's drug-free theater. And, I just wonder whether there's opportunities for us to do this everywhere. The brain is the brain is the brain. We can do this in Massachusetts, Michigan, or Montreal. It's the same adolescent brain. What do you think?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And, I do it on a smaller scale. So young people I work with really want to hear stories. And so just before the new year, there was a story that was all over the media. And so a 15-year-old had an overdose after using 4 pills. Only 4 pills. It was a young person who had used substances only a handful of times in his life. And, a pal said, I'll give you those pills and maybe you try them when you go home. Had no idea what they were. And so the poor young person passed away, had an overdose. And his father has been going around in schools and in different forums and telling the story of his son. Mm-hmm. And without being a psychodrama, it's a very real story. And then young people tell me about that story in my practice. And I can tell them all sorts of things about how the brain develops and, give them all the theory. But the lived experience in those examples and those images really, really can go a long way in influencing behavior, I would say.
Absolutely. And we've actually published a paper on that peer-to-peer effect, because it is one kid talking with another kid about their experience and saying, this is what happened to me. It doesn't need to happen to you. That's why the slogan of drug-free theater, the treatment of one becomes the prevention of many. And that's really what we're trying to do. And we're identifying, I wonder whether you would agree with this, that there are, several generalizations of why somebody has that first-time substance use. Peer pressure, think is one of them, where it's sort of a shortcut to friendship. One's own issues of self-esteem, depression, anxiety. Am I good enough? Do I fit in? And then our kids, the majority of our kids have had some sort of adverse childhood experience where they look at the stress and the abuse that they suffered and how that led them to want to feel just some happiness, some pleasure somewhere. So I'm just wondering, as you look at your large database, there's one thing about looking forward, what happens, but it sounds like you're also looking back at what happened before that led to that first time use. I mean, you talked about nicotine in utero, but what are you guys finding?
Absolutely. And we use what's called propensity score matching. And so we look at a series of different risk factors to sort of estimate how at risk a young person can be. So based on things like past family history, so have family history of use of different substances, mental health issues, different socioeconomic conditions or status, really different life course events, trauma, early trauma, neglect and abuse, and all those things. And it's really not one thing; it's many things that will create sort of this pattern of risk. And agreed, your hypotheses make a lot of sense. There's usually sort of a triggering factor, and with nicotine specifically, what happened recently is curiosity and sort of the appeal of things like flavors came into it. So it just seemed like something cool and people did it. And we know that using one substance like nicotine can lead to using others. And so we really need to look at a lot of different things together and look at that sort of big picture to see where a young person stands in terms of their risk and what could be those tipping points that would lead them to using it. And one big thing is access also. If the substance is there and accessible, then it's much more likely to be used.
Did you find that there was a decrease in use during COVID? Did you guys have the same sort of shutdown that we did?
Yeah, we had very interesting things happen during COVID because social interactions were reduced, fewer opportunities to have access to different things. But we also found that young people who were using before the pandemic and who were more isolated, in many cases used more intensely and developed a lot of issues related to that use. So problematic use in a smaller subset of young people was something we saw in Canada with confinement. And so that was interesting. And there's been, a general trend in substance use that there's less use of many substances over the past 20 to 30 years. So for many substances, young people today use less alcohol and cigarettes than, a generation ago. So those are big sort of trends. And then the pandemic shook things a little bit. And then we're seeing some of those trends and then some emerging ones like opioids and other synthetic substances that bring a whole new level of risk. And really it's all about considering all these things together and how they change.
Yeah. I mean, there was good data a while ago from Monitoring the Future that showed that tobacco use actually was less than marijuana use because kids, we think, had learned about tobacco and the risks and, they realized that they didn't want to give away their lungs. They didn't want to give away these different things. And, that's one of the great benefits we have of education. It doesn't need to be scary. That's the most important thing. Because I think that the thought, well, I'm going to scare you out of using has never really worked. It just has never worked. If the brain is going to choose between fear and pleasure, it's going to choose pleasure every time. But learning about your brain, that education, I think, does work. And being educated is part of what our sponsors do for us as well. They educate us about their products, which can help you in your world. So let's take a break. We'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show.
Hey, welcome back. And again, we're super grateful for you listening to the Dr. Joe Show. If you have anyone that you think might be a good sponsor, shoot us an email at drjoepodcast@gmail.com. DRJOE podcast@gmail.com. Give us your thoughts about the show too. We're wondering, are we talking to the trees or are people really gaining value in this? Please let us know. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the show.
And we're back with the Dr. Joe Show, talking with Dr. Joe and Dr. Nicholas Chadi about adolescence and substance use. And we were talking off air, Dr. Chadi, what are some of the newer things we need to be concerned about for our adolescents out there?
Well, so we talked earlier about nicotine and how it's changed a lot in recent years. In the past few months in Canada, we've seen the emergence of these synthetic nicotine pouches. A few commercial brands in the U.S. Zyn is something that we hear. It's a different name up here in Canada, Zonic. But those are sold by big tobacco companies, and they come in all sorts of flavors, and they're now becoming a new thing in young people. So always the same nicotine, finding these loopholes in the system to get sold and get into the hands of young people. And really the experience with nicotine has changed. So, you can smoke a few cigarettes in a row, but eventually, you'll get tired of it and you'll smell horrible and then you'll stop. You can vape continuously for hours and ingest so much nicotine. It's ridiculous, and get what we call nicotine toxicity. And similarly with products like flavored nicotine pouches that taste like who knows what fruit or sweet flavor. Well, that's certainly one thing, but things that are very concerning for me as a pediatrician specialized in substance use is these synthetic substances that are extremely potent, extremely cheap, and circulating among young people with a level of facility that's really, really surprising. And so we're seeing derivatives of opioids that are so strong. One pill can be lethal. And very often, drugs or substances that are thought to contain one thing also contain traces or, small amounts of something extremely potent. And we're seeing young people coming to the hospital, well, certainly in the US, but also in Canada with very severe presentations. And so the perception of risk of swallowing a pill is not the same as the perception of risk of injecting a substance, interestingly. So, in my practice, extremely few young people will say that they've injected drugs. And that has certainly changed. In Canada, there's a history of very severe methamphetamine use. And that was a big problem we had in crystal meth and stimulants. And so, that substance became well known to cause a lot of problems. But now we're seeing, benzodiazepines and opioids that are coming in these colorful little pills that are pressed in someone's basement and contain a mix of different things and can lead to addiction very quickly, can lead to withdrawal. If you use them for a few days or weeks in a row and then stop, then you feel extremely, extremely bad, and then can lead to overdose. And so I find myself talking about naloxone or Narcan extremely frequently with young people using for the first time because their friends have pills on them and they have no idea what these pills contain. Right. And so the conversation now is around safety, not to scare young people, but just to tell them that the substances that are circulating now in schools are extremely, extremely strong. And some are even, veterinary medicine substances with really high potential to cause harm. And so that's, I guess, the reality we're in.
And we're, again, Drugs for Theater, that is what this play is about. It's really about Narcan and how everybody should have it. And Alex Wally, Dr. Wally, was the leader in this here in Massachusetts. He was able to write a statewide prescription so that anybody could go and get Narcan. And for me, Narcan is not only lifesaver, but it is unique in that it is the only medicine that I prescribe that I expect to be diverted. There's no other medicine that I want you to give to somebody else because it's your medicine. But Narcan, that's what the expectation is. It's the only medicine that I prescribe that I expect someone to use on somebody else if they have to use it. It's unique in that way. we're coming towards the end of the show, and I just wanted to ask you the two questions, right? So the I am is saying that everyone's doing the best they can with the potential to change in the very next second to another best they can. But we are responsible and responding to and influenced by 4 domains. The home domain, we've been talking about that. The home domain, even in utero. Then the social domain, which is the rest of the world. We're talking about that as well. School and different functions. Those 2 domains are outside. In the 2 internal domains, the biological domain of your brain and body, and then what we call the I see. How do I see myself? How do I think other people see me? Human beings are very interested in what other people think or feel. It's called that empathy. But what we really want to know is, what are you thinking about me? So these 4 domains interact. So a small change in any one domain can have a big effect. We don't need to change everything. So Dr. Chadi, what small change can you recommend to our listeners based on what we're talking about tonight?
Well, we talked about a lot of things today. And a very small change that I can think of that relates to our conversation is actually having those conversations about substances. And there's so much stigma still around the use of substances and addiction. And there's a way to have the stigma not disappear, but diminish. And that starts with conversations, casual conversations, open conversation, and non-judgmental conversation, especially with young people, about the fact that substances exist, that they're around, and that having good talks about what the risks of using them entail is a really good, nice step forward. And so that's, I think, a small change I think we can all do together. So having those conversations about substances and trying to get informed.
I think that's so important because you're right. It is still so stigmatizing and people are ashamed to talk about it. So by getting rid of the pathology component, and that's what the I am is really trying to do. It's saying no one is broken. We're just responding to the 4 domains. If you don't like it, you can change it and come out of the shadows. It's safe to talk about these things. Completely agree. The second truth of the I am, everyone's got one. Everyone is interested through their I see domain, what you think or feel about them, which has an effect on their biological domain because it feels different when you feel respected or disrespected. You're part of someone's home or social domain. So the second truth of the I am, you control no one. You influence everyone. You get to choose the kind of influence you want to be. Dr. Nicholas Chadi, researcher, pediatrician, first pediatric addiction medicine specialist. What kind of influence do you want to be?
Well, I picked this path to be really in interaction constantly with young people, with adolescents. It's just such a key period of life for me where things really, really become very real with eventually responsibilities. The influence that I want to have is to try to be there and find ways for young people to thrive during adolescence and then for the rest of their lives. And so we like to talk about adolescence as this hard period, as a time that nobody feels good, nobody feels comfortable, nobody feels liked. And the influence that I want to have is, adolescence is beautiful. And this period of turmoil and change, is something we all either have learned from or will learn from or are currently learning from. And so, I just want to put in this positivity around adolescence and, help young people find ways to become themselves during those times. And that's really the influence that I'm hoping to have, in my career and just globally.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? And as you follow these folks, you've been working with some of them for years, I bet.
I have.
Well, I commend you and thank you so much for your time, for all the work you're doing up there in Canada. Folks, we got to bring this work right down here in the United States as well. We'll see you next week, folks. Thanks, Dr. Chadi.
Thank you, Dr. Joe.
Go, 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 then go, 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 go.